Hi, my name is Samantha Hill. I'm the Assistant Director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College. Um, and welcome to our virtual reading groups. So this week we had two sections to read, Invisibility and Withdrawal and the intramural warfare between thought and common sense. And it wasn't a lot of reading, but it's incredibly dense. And I think that Arendt is really touching on a lot of the key elements that she associates with the process and activity of thinking in these two sections. And what I wanted to do was take a look at a section and then just kind of outline some of the elements that she's talking about in terms of thinking that I think are really held nicely on page 67 in my volume here, in the first section on invisibility and withdrawal, beginning with the paragraph, although this last category of thought objects. Give everyone a chance to find it. So she says, although this last category of thought objects, concepts, ideas, categories, and the like became the special subject matter of quote-unquote professional philosophy, there is nothing in the ordinary life of man that cannot become the food for thought, that is, be subjected to the twofold transformation which prepares a sense object into a suitable thought object. So I'm just going to pause there, and I just kind of want to work through this paragraph because I think it contains a lot of what she's saying. So one of the ways in which thinking as an activity that we engage in for Arendt differs from theory, theoria, political philosophy proper, as we might conceive of it, is that we experience the world sensually, right? So we go out into the world, we have experiences, we perceive our experiences through our senses, and then we represent those experiences to ourselves through our imagination in the process of thinking. And that representation of our experiences then becomes, I always think of it very materially as the subject matter of our thinking, right? That we then engage in a process of thinking about. So we already have this kind of, twofold movement happening where we sensually experience the world, and then we represent those sensual experiences we have of the world to ourselves. And in that, for those of us who are, paying attention to the philosophical work that she's doing, although she's intentionally calling herself not a philosopher, in part for this reason here, is she's turning against the systematic philosophies of Kant and Hegel, which she gets to at the end of our second session for today, in order to think in part about the difference between thinking as this process that we engage in, which is sensual and based upon our experiences in the world, and the systematic philosophies that try to teach us how to know the world through processes, rational thinking. So the next sentence, she says, all the metaphysical questions, and remember she says at the beginning, and she says it throughout the life of the mind, that she's engaging in the process of dismantling metaphysics, right? She's not doing away with it in my reading. She's engaging in this process of taking it apart. All of the metaphysical questions, which became the special topics of philosophy, arise out of ordinary common sense experiences, right? So here's this other dualism that she's presenting us with, which becomes the subject of our second section for today, where we have ordinary common sense experiences. As people who appear in the world, we experience the world, and we have these common sense experiences. And then we engage these common sense experiences in our thinking. But these common sense experiences become special topics of philosophy, which she sees as somehow removing them from the language of common sense, which is very important for the way that she's thinking about how we make thinking appear in the world through language. And then she goes on to say, I lost my, the quest for meaning, which prompts men to ask them, is in no way different from men's need to tell the story of some happening of which they were witnesses or to write poems about it. Right? So we have this idea of storytelling and in this feeling, this being compelled to think about, to talk about, to tell our experiences and stories, to record them in poems, to write about them. And in all such reflecting activities, men move outside the world of appearances and use a language filled with abstract words, which of course had been long part and parcel of everyday speech before they became the special domain of philosophy. For thinking then, though not for philosophy, technically speaking, withdrawal from the world of appearances is the only essential precondition. And so this is a really important distinction that she's drawing between her conceptualization of thinking as an activity that we engage in and the proper work of the Kantian professional philosophers. In order to engage in this process of thinking, we have to completely withdraw, we never completely withdraw from the world, but we have to withdraw from the world of appearances, right? We go into that space of solitude, which she talks about in a couple of pages, where we engage in that two-in-one conversation with ourselves reflectively, where we draw those invisibles of thinking into our imagination and we contemplate them and think about them. There, we can transform them into thought things which will appear in the world through language, through what she's calling here abstract language, like metaphor and poetry, that allow them to appear. So thinking does not appear in the world for Arendt. It's always invisible, but our fundamental human condition is one of appearance. And so we never escape the world of experience altogether when we engage in the act of thinking, which is moving away from, she'll give the example of Plato's famous cave, in the next section, the idea that we can somehow escape the realm of human affairs and move into a pure realm of ideas where truth is located, is a kind of transcendental gesture that Arendt is pushing us away from. She sees it as unworldly thinking. And so she's I read this as trying to conceptualize thinking as a worldly activity that we engage in, where thinking has to move not from otherworldly ideas, but from experiences in the world that we have, these kind of common experiences that are particular, but are also shared and can be shared through language. And just to finish this paragraph here then, so in order to think about somebody, he must be removed from my presence. So long as we are together with him, we don't think either of him or about him. Thinking always implies remembrance. Every thought is strictly speaking an afterthought. It may, of course, happen that we start thinking about somebody or something that is still present, in which case we have removed ourselves surreptitiously from whatever our present surroundings are and are conducting ourselves as though we were already absent. So our thinking always deals with invisibles, and it deals with remembrance. And we are representing our experiences to ourselves, and we engage them in thinking. We are engaging in a form of remembrance. There's a really lovely passage that I like a lot, actually, in Origins of Totalitarianism, in the section on anti-Semitism, where she draws on Proust to make this argument. She describes him as kind of holding up this mirror to the mind's eye, where he can see the objects of experience and remember them, and then draw them into conversation. And I see her thinking about it in a similar way.
Yeah.
And the basic premise of the intramural war, which is that on the one hand, philosophers withdraw from the world, and in withdrawing from the world are almost like death. And there's a kind of almost worship of death and love of death among philosophers. They hate their body, they hate time, which, decays them. They want to find an immortal truth of some sort. Whereas common sense, she is what she calls that sixth sense that fits us into the world. And so there's a war between them. But what the twist Arendt adds to this is that it's really an intramural war amongst philosophers. Most philosophers don't actually want to die and don't actually want to shuffle off this mortal coil, and they sort of make a big show of it, but they don't actually mean it. It's sort of ironic. And that the war is, she says on page 83, really within the mind of the philosopher himself. There's not a whole lot of, most of the common sense people don't think it's much of a war. And the one story of someone who does is the story I mentioned last time we talked of Thales and who's walking along and falls into a well, and the maiden says, "Oh, Thales, you're so wise. You think you know the stars, but you can't see what's right in front of you." But what Arendt is saying here is that this is largely a war inside the philosopher self. Very few philosophers actually want to commit suicide, as she says on page 84 in one of her humorous remarks. So why does this matter? Why does she have a chapter on this? It's because she really wants to show the depth of the way that philosophical thinking, or not even philosophical thinking of which philosophers are professional representatives, are so, as she says, out of order in the world. I mean, that's the passage in this chapter I'd like. I'm not going to be here for much longer, so I'll just say on page 85, Arendt writes about this, and I thought it would be worth just taking a quick look at it. She says, Mnemosyne, or memory, is the mother of the Muses. Sorry, I don't know what that is. Is the mother of the Muses, and remembrance, the most frequent and also the most basic thinking experience, has to do with things that are absent, that have disappeared from my senses. And this is so central to Arendt's view of what thinking is, that we think the absent friend, the absent future, the absent past. Yet the absent that is summoned up and made present to my mind, a person, an event, a monument, cannot appear in the way it appeared to my senses, as though remembrance were a kind of witchcraft. In order to appear to my mind only, it must first be desensed. This is a word she uses over and over again in the next 100 pages. And it's just such a shocking word, desensed. And the capacity to transform sense objects into images is called imagination. And here's where she's going to begin to argue that imagination is the core of thinking. She continues, without this faculty of desensing or imagination, which makes present what is absent in a desensed form, no thought process and no trains of thought would be possible at all. This idea of trains of thought is going to come back in the last chapter of the whole book on thinking, so you might want to mark it in that way. It's going to be a very important idea for her. So no trains of thought would be possible at all without desensing and imagination, because in the train of thought we generalize away from all spatial ideas, and thus we can have this train of thought that goes on infinitum. Hence, and here's the key section I actually wanted to bring us to, hence thinking is out of order, not merely because it stops all the other activities so necessary for the business of living and staying alive, but because it inverts all ordinary relationships. What is near and appears directly to our senses is now far away, and what is distant is actually present. While thinking, I am not where I actually am. I am withdrawn into some never land, she writes. So I just want to me, this is central to what she's doing. Thinking is an affront to common sense. It's an affront to the common sense which fits us into the world. And if we really want to understand this sheer activity of thinking and what thinking is, we have to understand that it is at war with common sense. So why would she then say it's an intramural war and not actually a war? Because she says that really the only people who think about that war are philosophers. Common sense people don't think about that war. They don't ever think about withdrawing from the world of common sense. And so that's, in many ways, how I understand some of this chapter. I don't know if that. So the cave. Go back to Nancy's question about the cave. The cave is a flight from the world, and the question is, does the philosopher come back into the cave, and will he Will he be killed, as Plato says? And she says that many philosophers are always worried that they're going to be killed by the many, but that this is really a false worry. How many philosophers have been killed by the many? One. And that's the one Plato was worried about. But since then, it hasn't really happened.